this time, a sword was an expensive and precious object. Their owners would no more throw them away than a modern person might throw away their mobile phone. All kinds of objects pertaining to the daily lives of soldiers have been found left behind too. Bath sandals and writing tablets, pots and buckets and buckles. One day, it seems, everyone at Vindolanda just got up and left. After the Romans departed and the border collapsed, local people began to use Hadrian's Wall as a quarry, taking its high-quality blocks of stone to build their own houses and barns, even churches, so that now the wall is woven into the fabric of countless medieval buildings across the region. Near Carlisle, the medieval priory of Lanercost, for instance, was built using a large amount of material stolen from the wall, which runs just half a kilometre to the north. You can still see Roman inscriptions on some of the priory's stones, boasting about which legions were stationed on the wall. Meanwhile, tribal chieftains and local warlords, some of whom had been officers in the Roman army until recently,
That's a
moved into
cop-out.
the forts along the wall
With
and
clever
used them as
jokes and
private
unexpected
castles.
twists, come on.
In one fort known as
That's a
Burdelswald,
cop-out. You gotta
it seems
explain
the
it,
descendants of the
ChatGPT.
original
You're
garrison
not. I
still
give you
live there
a
century
C-
after the
minus in
departure
that
of Rome,
response.
passing down their uniforms, flying regimental insignia, and building timber constructions inside its crumbling ruin. They probably received pay and supplies from people living in the area in exchange for protection, and they maintained a kind of Roman identity in order to increase their legitimacy. To the south, large cities like London fell gradually into disrepair. Trade at London's port had been slowing over the past century, but now it finally stopped altogether. Its suburbs turned into wasteland, or were tilled for farming. The large church built by Magnus Maximus on Tower Hill burned to the ground, and it seems people lacked either the knowledge, the resources, or the will to rebuild it. London's great Roman Forum, too, was dismantled and quarried for stone, and its public bath was torn down. Its great basilica, which was once the largest building in northwest Europe, was also taken apart. People began to be buried inside the city limits, something the Roman authorities would never have allowed. And of these burials, studies show that 4 times more have been found with wounds from stabbing and slicing weapons than in the previous period. London's population of nearly 30,000 people began to drift away, back to a simpler existence in the countryside, to timber longhouses and roundhouses built of thatch and wattle. In some places, the ancient hill forts of the pre-Roman Britons, which had lain empty for centuries, now burst back into life. Excavations in these sites have found objects that seem to have been looted from the abandoned Roman towns and villas that now littered the countryside, dressed stone and glass and pottery. And amid the slow hollowing out of London, archaeological evidence shows that an enclave of the ultra-wealthy continued to live a somewhat Roman existence in a kind of gated community. They enjoyed the same wine and olive oil they always had, presumably imported at great expense. They denied the writing on the wall for as long as they could, but the decline was unstoppable. The rest of the city descended into chaos, and nature crept back to reclaim its streets and alleys. By the end of the 4th century, everything south of the River Thames had been abandoned. Large pockets of London's urban fabric had turned into patches of overgrown wasteland, and people began to grow wheat in the middle of the city. By the end of the 5th century, London was deserted. It was now an uninhabited ruin, a city of ghosts, sinking into the marsh and mud of the river. By the end of the 5th century, London was deserted. We can imagine ivy growing over its crumbling walls, and elder too, young trees pushing their roots between the bricks and stones of its buildings. The only people left in London were scavengers. They came to find things like iron nails, which could be recycled. The forests around London would also have been cut down, and so the only source of usable timber would have been that left in the decaying city. So little by little, people tore London apart. One artifact, known as the Billingsgate brooch, tells the story of these scavengers. It was dropped amid the fallen roof tiles of a building known as the Billingsgate House, perhaps by a scavenger who had looted it and feared being robbed, or by someone exploring the ruins who simply dropped it and couldn't find it afterwards. Either way, it's a fascinating artifact that speaks of the afterlife of the ruined city of London. And it wasn't only London that fell into ruins. In cities like Bath, which inspired the poetry of the ruin that we opened with, urban life continued in some form after the departure of Rome. While its great temples crumbled and grand public buildings fell into disrepair, its city authorities still managed basic repairs like recobbling the streets. But without their links to the Roman economy, the slow death of Britain's cities was all but assured. By the early 5th century, all of Britain's towns, large and small, simply ceased to exist. The city of York, where once the Emperor Constantine the Great had been crowned, now stood empty and in ruins, slowly reclaimed by the seasonal floods of the River Ouse. We know this because archaeologists have found the remains of water beetles, water voles, shrews and froghoppers inside the city. All animals that live only in flooded and swampy ground.
Oh my god, dude, that's another $1 million idea right there from ChatGPT. Holy moly.
The incoming Saxon people were obviously impressed by the ruins of Roman cities, but also seem to have feared them as places of ghosts and curses. They rarely came near to the ruins and built their settlements far away from them. At some sites like Caia Colemion, there's some evidence that the wells of the decaying city were filled in to prevent people from returning. Ritual objects were also left behind, perhaps to ward off the curse that was believed to hang over these crumbling stones. It's no coincidence that tales of giants form such a prominent part of British folklore. To see why, you just have to imagine the mighty temples and public buildings that were left behind in the wake of Roman rule.
I don't know how I wasn't shot there.
To people who no longer knew how to build these things, these crumbling walls, these awesome constructions of bygone centuries, must have seemed the work of a race of gods who had once walked England's rolling fields and ancient primeval forests. Perhaps to truly understand how it must have felt to live in the time after Roman rule, it's best to end the same way we started, with the Old English poem, The Ruin. As you listen, think about what it must have felt like to live in this time, when the foreign occupiers who had brought so much change finally left.
That kind of is already an episode like that.
It was a time when it felt that history was no longer moving
Where Peter
forward,
makes a bar in the basement and a link.
Tomorrow would be a darker time than today.
Oh, what's her name?
A time when all you had left to remember that lost golden age
Mrs. Griffin?
is the landscape,
I forget her name.
strewn with monumental blocks of
Lois?
stone, the cavernous bathing halls, and the overgrown ruins
Becomes a
slowly
singer?
and unstoppably crumbling
And
into
revealing clothes and her like lingerie and shit.
Far and wide the slain perished, days of pestilence came. Death took all the brave men away. Their places of war became deserted places, the city decayed.
Why?
The rebuilders perished, armies into the earth. And so these buildings grow desolate, and this
Finally,
red
they
curve
finally line
parts
up,
from its
like,
tiles of the
finally,
ceiling
man.
vault. The ruin has fallen to the ground, broken into mounds, where at one time shone many a warrior, joyous and ornamented with gold-bright splendor. On the Spjörtenberg, Braden riches.
Thank you once again for listening to the Fall of Civilizations podcast. I'd like to give a special thanks to my voice actors, Jake Barrett-Mills, Jacob Rowlandson,
Voice actors, that's
Shem
dope,
Jacobs,
man.
and a special thank you goes to Dr. Rebecca Pinner at the University of East Anglia for allowing us to hear the poetry of the ruin in its original Old English. I love to hear your thoughts and
Big
responses
Stas,
on
what's
Twitter,
up, man?
so please come and tell me what you thought. You can follow me at Paul MM Cooper.
T minus
And if
48
you'd like
hours
updates about
until
the
we're
podcast,
playing Breath of the
announcements
Wild,
about
my
new
friend.
episodes, as well as images and maps relevant to the episode, you can follow the podcast at Fall of Civ Pod, with underscores separating the words.
What's up, broski?
This podcast can only keep going with the support of our
Yes,
generous
lol,
subscribers
yeah,
and
less
patrons.
of this pain.
You keep me running, you help me
Oh my
cover my
God.
costs.
I hope,
And
you know what I
also let me
want to,
dedicate more
you know what I
time
hope
to
I can do? I hope I
researching,
can play it
writing,
on my,
recording and editing,
like, not on a
to get the episodes
CRT.
out to you faster,
Probably.
and bring as much life and detail to them as
To
possible.
the TV, my
I
big,
want to thank all
I'm
my
blessed I
subscribers
do
for
have
making
a
this happen.
big screen TV. I'm really
If
blessed
you enjoyed
to
this
spend
episode,
a
please
lot when I
consider
was working.
contributing
God
and help
bless, I
keep the
hope it
podcast
protects
running.
it.
For now, goodbye, and
Did I
thanks
get
for
any of the
listening.
saves? Really? Why? Oh, because it'll spoiler? It'll be a big spoiler? Yeah, you're right, dude. I won't delete it. I'll just play. I'll just open a new one. I'll delete one if I need to, but... I got stuck. No spoilers, please. I know you were providing it. No, just delete old saves. I hear you. Accept. Mario Kart. Word. I can imagine, bro. Smash Bros. The Assyrians. I think we've seen this one. But this one looks so interesting. Yeah, like this is like one of the most interesting. God, unlimited things from law. Oh, no way.
1 BC, at the height of the period known as the Greek Golden Age, a Persian prince named Cyrus the Younger was fighting a bitter civil war against his brother and was trying to seize the throne of Persia. To help him in this fight, he hired a mercenary army of mostly Greek soldiers, 10,000 men who traveled the long road to Persia to fight on his behalf. Among them was the Greek writer and adventurer named Xenophon, and he later wrote about this expedition in his work entitled Anabasis. Xenophon and his companions met the enemy Persian army at the Battle of Cunaxa, on the banks of the Euphrates River, and they gave the Persian prince Cyrus value for his money. The Greek heavy troops beat the Persians back and delivered a victory for the man who had hired them. But when the dust of battle had cleared, they heard the bad news. Cyrus the Younger had been killed, apparently knocked from his horse by a young common soldier. His claim to the throne of Persia had died with him, and the war was over. For the Greeks, this must have been heartbreaking. Their long journey, the victorious battle, and all their sacrifices had been for nothing. Their general had also been killed, and all of their senior commanders captured, leaving them without a leader and stranded in the middle of a foreign land. Now Xenophon and what remained of his 10,000 men had to find their way home to Greece. They knew that their only route was to reach the Black Sea, which lay across the wide deserts of what is today Iraq. They were terrified. They had few supplies, and the enemy army was already pursuing them close behind. They hastily elected some leaders from among them, and Xenophon was one of them. He told his men to throw away everything they carried, shedding weight in order to outrun their enemies.
Huge, man.
And so they pelted across the deserts and the fertile river lands dotted with date palms, following the
Farmland's
course
cool.
of the river Tigris north. And it's while they fled
And a new
in
one
this
I got.
manner
Oh my
that they
goodness.
stumbled upon something that must have made them stop in their
Nice.
tracks. It was the enormous, crumbling ruin of a city, completely deserted, and full
Oh,
of
cool,
the
man.
vast ruins of ancient
Yeah, dude.
buildings.
Hell yeah, dude.
This
I'm
city was larger
I used to
than
do indoor
anything
planting.
Xenophon had seen back home in Greece, and later he wrote about this discovery in his work Anabasis.
Oh, you're in Florida.
Kai hoi men polemioi,
Of course.
outo praxantes apelthon, hoi de
Nice, yeah.
aspalos porevomenoi,
The Greeks continued their march unmolested through the remainder of the day. They
Yeah,
arrived
so,
at the Tigris
nice.
River. Here was a large,
Yeah, dude,
deserted city.
it's like a massive
Its wall was
snowstorm right here right now.
25
I'm
feet
just
in
trying to
breadth,
ignore it.
100 in height.
Trying to ignore that.
The whole
that's actually
circuit of the
happening
wall
right now.
was 11 kilometers. It was built of clay bricks, rested upon a stone foundation 6 meters high. Nearby this city was a pyramid of stone, a plethrum in breadth,
Got a lot of
and 2
wind on
plethora in
me.
height. And upon this pyramid were many barbarians who
scary.
had fled away from the neighboring villages.
hypsos diopleithron epitautas.
Some rain. Yeah, I saw.
olonton
You guys,
barbaron,
it's been what,
esan
cloudy
ekton
and rainy. I've been
plesiou
watching the
gomon
weather.
apopefeogotes.
Weird
But
in the.
Xenophon didn't have time to linger. The pursuing Persians were right
Sucks.
behind them, and he couldn't spare any time to
In the
explore
winter.
the ruins. They dashed
In the dry
onwards,
season.
following the river north. But then, only a day or two
I think it's an
later,
El Nino
the
year,
Greeks
right?
came across another ruin.
Something like
This
that.
one even larger and more impressive, surrounded by an enormous series of crumbling walls.
Enteuthen de poreuthes en stathmon, henna parasagas, hex prostekos eren, meg.
The Greeks marched 34 kilometers to a great stronghold, deserted and lying in ruins. The foundation of its wall was made of polished stone, full of shells. It was 15 meters in breadth and 15 in height. Upon this
15.
foundation was built a wall of brick,
Yeah.
15 meters in breadth and 30 meters in height. And the circuit of the wall
Cool,
was
bro.
30
Check it out. Check out your
kilometers.
plant. Your
Ote
plants.
apollusan tenarchen, hypoperson medoi.
Once again, they had no time to stop. But it's clear that the sight of these lonely, crumbling ruins affected Xenophon. For days afterwards, he asked any local people he encountered who had built such enormous constructions, all alone out there in the desert. No one he spoke to could tell him anything, and it seemed no one even knew the names of these great cities. Some people thought they might have been built by the Medes, a people who now
on.
occupied the area. Others told fantastical stories about the gods bringing down fire and thunder to destroy these ancient walls, killing everyone who had once lived within them. Today, we do know the names of these
Insane.
cities, and it's thought that Xenophon,
pretty cool.
at the end of the 5th century BC, was the earliest person to stumble upon them and write an account. These were the cities of Nimrud and Nineveh. At the time when Xenophon stumbled across these ruins, nearly 2.5 millennia ago, the first stones of the Parthenon in Athens had been laid only 50 years earlier. The Colosseum in Rome would not be built for another 500 years.
I'm actually not a fan
But
of
the city of
repotting, to be
Nineveh
honest.
had already been an ancient ruin
That's one of the
for
things
more than
I've
2 centuries.
is if you
This
can plant
mighty
it
city
and it's
had
in the
flourished,
biggest pot that
boomed
you
into
know
a
it's going to grow
towering capital,
to begin
home
with.
to hundreds of
I find
thousands
it's usually
of
best,
people.
but
It had
if you're
given
into,
birth
like,
to
seedlings
some
and
of
stuff,
the ancient world's most beautiful
understand.
art and architecture, and then all at
but if you're going
once
from seed,
fallen
I would
into
just
dust.
s-
Xenophon
put it
and
in the
his
biggest
men did
pot.
eventually return to Greece, and when he wrote his
Obviously you
memoirs,
need to
he gives
protect
special attention
the
to
soil,
those
but-
moments when he looked out over the sand-blasted desert the
some leaves
grasses
and shit.
sprouting between the crumbling
Some red
bricks
bark.
as the wind battered his hair and tugged at his clothes. In those moments, Xenophon must have asked himself, who were these people who built such vast
This is repotting,
cities out
it's
here
such
in the
stress
desert?
to the plant's
How
root
could such a
ball
great
system.
metropolis vanish so
And
completely
then
beneath the sands?
you might
And if
have to
so
even
many people
prune
had
some
once
leaves,
lived
to be
there,
honest,
what
because you're
in
going to
all
lose
the
some
world
root mass. You
could
need
have
to
happened to them?
compensate by having the shoot mass in equal volume, or else the plant will start to, like, the top will start to die. It's just too much of a shock. Maybe I'm just too aggressive with them. So if I can go straight from seed and to never repot, that's like ideal.
My name's Paul Cooper, and you're
And you
listening
gotta start
to the
with good
Fall of
soil. You
Civilizations
can't
podcast.
make up for
Each
soil
episode,
through
I look
time.
at a civilization
to
of the
start at
past
the
that
very
rose to
beginning.
glory, and then collapsed
You gotta
into
make
the
sure your
ashes of
soil is
history.
good and
I want to
perfect.
ask, what did they
You
have
can't
in
just
common?
add shit to it
What
after,
led
because that
to their
doesn't work.
fall?
It never works.
And what did it feel like to be a person alive at the
So you
time?
have to start from
who
day
witnessed
one.
the end of their world.
And it's such a
In this
humbling
episode,
learning
I want to look
experience
at
about
one of the most
responsibility
remarkable ancient
and reaping and
civilizations,
sowing.
the society
it starts from
known
the
today
soil.
as the Assyrian
100%.
Empire. I want to explore how the
It's not the
Assyrians
lights,
built
it's
their
not the
empire out of the
nutrients,
ashes
not
of the
the
Bronze Age,
temperature.
and built an empire of
humidity.
iron that lasted for
Fucking
centuries.
soil, man.
I want to show how they expanded
Okay, maybe
and
not. If
developed
you're
to become
hydroponics,
perhaps
it's
the
it's
world's
it's all.
first military superpower,
But if you're like
as
Earth,
well as fostering
then
an
yeah, the soil
extraordinary
is really
flourishing
key.
of art and learning. And finally, I want to tell the story of what happened to cause
But
their
hydroponics is
final,
fucking amazing.
devastating collapse.
I would love to do hydroponics. Oh my god, can you imagine?
In this episode, we return
Just a
for
lot
the
of
first
water, man.
time to a setting that we've seen before.
I can make
In
hydroponic
episode
system out of
8
PVC.
on the Sumerians. These are the arid desert lands of Mesopotamia.
Dude, I bought a lathe. I have a lathe.
Mesopotamia is a vast floodplain.
I guess you don't need a lathe to
For
make
millions of
PVC
years,
hydroponic
its
shit.
lands have been
But yeah, I
watered
bought a
by
lathe
two
a
great
couple of years
rivers,
ago.
the River Tigris and
But I
the
didn't
River
have like a lathe
Euphrates.
stand, and I didn't have
These
all the
great
pieces.
watercourses flow south
And it
from
was
the
pretty
mountains
daunting
of Turkey and
to
bring
start doing it.
enormous quantities
So
of
it's
silt
this year for
down
Christmas I
with
bought
them.
myself
If we were to soar
a
high
4.5
above the
inch
Earth's
chuck
surface,
that
we would
holds a
see these
piece
two
that has
rivers
4.5 inches
as vivid
diameter.
lines of green
I have a pretty small bench
snaking
really,
through the
right?
dusty land.
And
The rivers Tigris and
A
Euphrates form one
centering,
arm of a geographical feature that has come to be known as
bit
the
holder
Fertile Crescent.
on the other end.
This is an area of land roughly in the shape of a half moon that runs from the
That was
marshlands of
such a
southern
fucking
Iraq,
blessing.
north up the silt-rich rivers, then west
But I'm
to the
thinking,
humid coast
if
of
I'm gonna,
Syria.
like, what I want
The
to do,
Fertile
bro, is I
Crescent
want to start
continues
building
south
and making
through the
something and
mountainous
selling
lands
something.
of Lebanon, down
on
the
the
Mediterranean
internet.
coast
And
of
if I have a
modern
lathe,
Israel
I was gonna
and
do
into
spin
Egypt,
tops.
watered
I don't think the
by
market is
River
that big for
Nile
it,
and its rich
unless I get
delta.
people into it.
Surrounded
I'm
by
thinking making
high,
some incredible spin
treacherous
tops
mountains to the north and east, bounded
What's it
by the
called?
Mediterranean Sea in the
Acrylic?
west and the impassable
Like liquid
deserts of
acrylic is
Arabia
just
to the
so
south.
goddamn expensive.
This sweeping corridor
I gotta be able
created
to
the
find an
environment
efficient way to do
where
it.
some of the world's first
Just make
great
small ones.
societies rose up.
And I could put figurines inside. So what I'm thinking is I'm putting like Dragon Ball Z
To
figurines.
us, the
Like
Assyrian
two of them
Empire
fighting
feels
inside
like
the
a
acrylic
relic
spin
of
top.
the
Even if people don't
impossibly
spin a
distant
top,
past.
it'd be such
But
an
it's
awesome
worth
piece of
reminding
art.
ourselves that for them, their world was already ancient.
I can do like a
The
Lego
earliest
Batman.
settlements in
Or,
this
you
region,
know, all that shit.
like the ones found at Göbekli Tepe
And charge, I don't know.
and Çatalhöyük,
Get like a really
are
high quality
truly
figurines.
each
And a really
between
beautiful
12
top,
and 9,000
and charge, I don't
years
know, like
old.
50 bucks or more.
They
You
are
know what I
some
mean?
of the first
So like $5,
evidence
$10
we
in
have
figurines, make
of
like
humans
something they're like,
living
yeah, I
in
want
large
this, and
societies after
a
the end
combination.
of the Ice Age.
of that it's beautiful.
But the Assyrians also
It's
had
I
an
mean,
incredibly
it's
rich
useful.
awareness
It is utility.
of
It
their
has
own
use.
ancient history
And the fact that it has its
cultural roots
figurines
of their society.
could be cool.
Since the invention of
A little
writing by the
Pokemon.
Sumerians around the year 3200 BC, humans had been passing their knowledge down
Shout out Gaming
from
Prince
generation
with a
to
Z
generation. And it's
on
hard
Instagram,
to
bro. I
overstate
never
just how
received,
powerful
never
this
received the
was.
print, man. It
The
never came.
Assyrians held on to the memory
I honestly
of
was thinking,
several
I swear
of
to
the
God, I
great
never received it.
kings of the
I
Sumerian
think
age,
the Australian
revering
government
them as semi-mythical
stopped it,
heroes.
maybe because it had
Among these
a
was the
pistol,
legendary
like a
hero
gun,
Gilgamesh,
maybe in
who
it, you know,
slayed
because you said you sent me the
monsters and
golden
went on a
eye
quest to find the secret of eternal life.
front
And
thing,
they
and,
still
if it's
told
like Bond
stories
holding a pistol,
about
they
the
may have
Akkadian
confiscated
king
it.
Sargon the
Not even
Great,
joking.
who, for the later Assyrians,
Coming from
had lived nearly 2
Aussie land.
millennia in the past. For them,
Or some
Sargon
probably just
was
liked it
about
and
as
stole it.
distant
That's
in the
also
past as
more likely.
Julius Caesar is for us. But his name was still on their lips. They
The
still
most
told
probable
stories about him,
explanation.
wrote about him, and drew inspiration from him. As this Middle Assyrian
And
text,
the most probable
called
is probably
Sargon,
someone
the King
liked
of
it
Battle, demonstrates.
and stole it and
While
said
Sargon dwelt
it
in
was
the land,
valid to
his
take
heroes
it
with
because
him,
of the gun.
12 he chose. He brought his army across
That's what
the
I think
fir tree
happened.
land. He conquered the cedar mountain. He took for his weapon the lightning bolt of his god.
Like the Sumerians before them, the Assyrians saw the ruins of ancient cities scattering their landscape and developed stories to explain how they got there. They believed that a great flood had once washed over the world, and that these ruined heaps of stone and brick were a remnant of this destructive ancient event. So I think it's worth reminding ourselves right at the outset that the Assyrians did not think of themselves as we might think of them, as an early culture at the dawn of human history, but as a people on the cutting edge of human progress, the product of a long and ancient line, and the culmination of all that humanity was capable of. Since the fall of the Sumerian Empire, the language of Akkadian had become the region's most common tongue, replacing the old Sumerian language. And the cities that had once formed part of the Sumerian empires had broken away. They were now a loose constellation of independent city-states, dotted up and down the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. Each city had their own king, their own army, and their own god. As we saw in episode 8, for much of the region's early history, the Akkadians had been something of a junior partner to their Sumerian cousins. But now, with the collapse of Sumer, the Akkadian cities of the north were finally free, and they set out on their own journeys. One of these cities
Like, why?
was the city of
I hate
Ashur.
this game. I don't want to be in Left Street. I really don't. But he's there. Oh.
Ashur was occupied from at least the year 2500 BC. It was founded at the height of Sumerian rule, on a bank of the river Tigris in northern Iraq, about halfway between the modern cities of Tikrit and Mosul. Ashur was probably an early trading city. It would have been a town of tents and houses built from river clay, thatched with reeds. The smells of cattle and wood smoke would have drifted through its muddy streets. The sounds of people and the fluttering of the leaves of date palms, perhaps already the first canals being dug to water its fields. In its early days, it would have been a very humble place, and it would be hard to imagine the glorious legacy that its people would one day construct. Throughout the Sumerian period, the town of Ashur did well, and some of this was down to its natural advantages. It was nestled on a bend of the river Tigris that sheltered it on its north and east side, and its builders improved its natural defences with a system of strong buttressed walls that made it a strong fortress. The rivers of Mesopotamia were the land's lifeblood. They brought water for drinking and to irrigate the fields, but in the rough landscape, they also acted as the highways along which trade could move on barges and ships. Carvings of the time show long boats powered with oars, forging over the brown waters of the rivers, carrying wheat and barley, copper and tin, as well as fine woods and stone from the north. As a crucial stop along one of these rivers, Ashur soon grew to be a wealthy place. Excavations of its houses show that by the second millennium, many of them were spacious mansions. It became common for wealthy families to keep vaults beneath their floors to hide their many valuables, jewelry made of gold and polished brass, inlaid with semi-precious stones, like carnelian, agate, and the brilliant blue lapis lazuli. Excavations have even uncovered dozens of libraries and archives in the city, where texts written in cuneiform on clay tablets were stored, a clear indicator of a city overflowing with wealth.
Just so shit.
The wealthy families of Ashur were also able to donate handsomely to religious organizations, and the city would become home to no fewer than 34 temples to the various gods worshipped by all the people of Mesopotamia. Gods like the sun god Shamash, and the moon god Sin, the storm god Adad, Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, and of course, the king of the gods, Enlil. We can imagine walking through the city streets at this time and hearing the incantations washing out of the temple doors and overlapping in the hot air, the priests of the different gods competing for attention in the crowded city, the ringing of bells and the banging of drums, the singing of hymns. Funeral processions may have floated past, chanting poetry such as this surviving devotional hymn to the Babylonian god Marduk.
The man who is departing in glory, may his soul shine radiant as brass. To that man may the sun give life, and Marduk, eldest son of heaven, grant him an abode of happiness.
The temples also performed services for the sick. If you visited the temple of Ishtar with an ailment, it's likely you would have heard something like this prayer being said over you by one of its priests.
I think I'm shooting too late there.
Bind the sick man to
I think I'm
heaven,
shooting too late.
for from the earth he is being torn away. Of the brave man who was so strong, his strength has departed. In his bodily frame he lies dangerously ill. But Ishtar, who in her dwelling is grieved for him, descends from her mountain, unvisited of men. To the door of the sick man she comes.
And
Oh, the double
soon,
duck.
like most cities of this time, the city of Ashur developed a god of its own. In fact, the city virtually became a god. In the religious systems of Mesopotamia, gods and cities had an intimate and interwoven relationship. The gods of this time performed many of the duties that they do for us today. They could be called for in times of need or given sacrifices to ward off evil. But at this time, each city also had a god in the same way that every sports team has a mascot. The god was believed to quite literally live in the highest chamber of the city's temple, often in a statue dedicated to them. If you visited another city on business, it was considered sensible to give an offering to the city's god while you were there. And if two cities went to war, It was thought that their gods were battling it out in the heavens, just as their armies were fighting down on earth. And the more a city succeeded, the more power its god was presumed to have. As the city of Ashur grew in importance, its people named the city's god after the city itself, and so the god Ashur was born. Grand temples were thrown up to this new deity, and as the city went from strength to strength, worship of Ashur rose to become the highest form of religion for its people. This god rapidly took on new symbols and iconography. He became thought of as a robed man wearing a crown and holding a bow, often appearing in carvings at the center of a winged disc, looking down on the world
Come on.
and the golden
How is
city
he still
over
alive?
which
Like,
he
what?
presided. As the confidence of the cult of Ashur grew, eventually the position of Enlil as the king of the gods, a position he had held for 1,000 years, was in jeopardy. Over the next centuries, the god Ashur even took over Enlil's wife, the goddess Ninlil, and his sons Ninurta and Zababa. Ashur, and not Enlil, was now the supreme god for this city's people. The people of the city of Ashur would soon become known as Ashuraye, but today we call them Assyrians. Like many of the powerful cities of this region, for the next millennium or so, the Assyrians of the city of Ashur would make several attempts to found their own kingdom, and a number of times they succeeded. One great king named Shamshi-Adad ruled at the end of the 19th century BC, and he conquered large areas outside of Ashur, bringing back great wealth to the city. Under his reign, the people of Ashur built a grand royal palace, and the temple to the god Ashur was furnished with a ziggurat, an enormous stepped tower that in the Bronze Age was a statement of a city's membership to an elite and powerful club. But this early flourishing of Assyrian power was
Why?
stamped out by the rival power of Babylon, a powerful city in the south that established its own empire under the famous king Hammurabi. This was the fate of the people of Ashur for much of the second millennium BC. They were able to rise a little bit before being swallowed up by a bigger fish. They were folded into the empires of Babylon, the Mitanni, and the Hittites, and would usually spend a century or so as a possession before throwing off their rulers and once more going it alone. But throughout this time, there was also a flourishing of Assyrian culture. One epic poem, known today as the Tukulti Ninurta epic, has survived from this time. It glorifies Assyrian military conquests in the south and sets out a model for how the ideal Assyrian
double tap.
king should behave.
Based on my
And it also
terrible gameplay.
contains a vision of the fierce, warlike spirit of the Assyrian people.
They charged forward furiously to fray, without any armor. They had stripped off their breastplates, discarded their clothing. They tied up their hair and polished their weapons. The fierce, heroic men danced with sharpened weapons. They blasted at one another like struggling lions, with eyes flashing. Particles drawn in a whirlwind swirled around in combat. Death, as if on a day of thirsting, slakes itself at the sight of the warrior.
But as the second millennium BC drew to a close, around the years 1200 to 1150 BC, the Assyrians would face a challenge of astonishing magnitude. The period that followed has gone down in history with the name the Bronze Age Collapse. As we saw in our second episode, for reasons we still don't entirely understand, a wave of destruction would soon wash over this region. Hordes of a mysterious force known as the Sea Peoples would land on its shores. Famine would spread from city to city. This destruction would sweep whole civilizations off the map and leave virtually no inhabited cities left in the eastern Mediterranean region. Only two great societies emerged on the other side of this destruction. One was Egypt. As we saw in our second episode, the Egyptians managed to stop the Sea Peoples in a daring ambush on the waters of the Nile Delta and just about held their society together. And the other was Assyria. It survived by withdrawing from its recent conquests and holding on to only those territories that were essential to keeping its trade routes open. It withdrew back to its heartland and survived in a diminished form. But as the wave of destruction ended, the challenges that Assyria faced were enormous, as the historian Georges Roux recounts.
Towards the end of the 10th century BC, Assyria was at her lowest ebb. Economic collapse was impending. She had lost all her possessions west of the Tigris, and her vital arteries, the great trade routes that ran through the mountain passes, were in foreign lands. Hostile highlanders occupied not only the heights of the Zagros, but the foothills down to the edge of the Tigris Valley, while Aramaean tribes pitched their tents almost at the gates of Ashur.
At this time, Assyria's territory consisted of little more than a strip of land along the river Tigris, surrounded on all sides by determined enemies. But there were also things to be thankful for. For one thing, Assyria's enemies seemed incapable of uniting. For much of this history, they hated each other as much as they hated the Assyrians, and this would prove crucial for Assyrian survival. In the flat plains of Iraq, Assyria had no natural boundaries or defenses. For its survival, it relied on the fact that its enemies could be dealt with one by one. The powerful Assyrian army could march one way, then the other, smashing each enemy in turn, and subsequent kings would do everything they could to ensure that this continued to be the case. The main cities of Assyria were also virtually untouched by the disaster of the Bronze Age collapse, and they continued their economic output throughout the crisis. Assyria still had chariots and horses and weapons. It had access to iron, the new metal that had been used for ceremonial and decorative objects for centuries, but was only just beginning to be used to forge weapons and armor. The introduction of iron meant that Assyria was no longer dependent on the fragile supply of copper that came to them from across the mountains in the faraway mines of Afghanistan. Iron occurs 10 times more commonly in the Earth's crust than copper, and could be found just about anywhere. The warriors of Assyria had been trained by years of constant fighting, and were now among the best in the world. And perhaps most importantly, the line of royal succession had supposedly not been broken for more than 200 years, meaning that the kings of Assyria claimed to draw on an ancient and unchallenged legitimacy among their people. In this region at the time, no other state could say the same. And to at least one Assyrian king, it must have seemed clear that if Assyria could only seize its opportunity, it could become a power unlike any that had been seen before. That man's name was Tiglath-Pileser I. Tiglath-Pileser ascended to the throne in the year 1114 BC. He was the son of a harsh ruler named Ashur-Resha-Ishi I. His father had been remorseless in his campaigns, giving himself the title the Avenger of Assyria and merciless hero of battle. One surviving edict by his father declares that the penalty for fraternizing with palace women was to be thrown into an oven, and it's clear that Tiglath-Pileser inherited at least some of his father's harsh reputation. A series of laws was written during his reign, called the Middle Assyrian Law Code, and they included incredibly harsh punishments against women. In one, a married woman who has an affair is decreed to be killed. But he was an energetic ruler and a skillful campaigner. One of his royal inscriptions describes him in the following manner.
Unrivaled king of the universe, king of the four kingdoms, king of all princes, lord of lords, whose weapons the god Ashur has sharpened, and whose name he has pronounced eternally for control of the four quarters. Splendid flame which covers the hostile land like a rainstorm.
This kind of overflowing self-praise is quite typical of how all Assyrian kings described themselves. But in the case of Tiglath-Pileser, it's clear that the challenges he faced were indeed formidable. He had inherited an Assyria that was threatened on multiple fronts. In the north, climate shifts had been driving nomadic horsemen into the northern plains. The Mushku people of Syria had occupied certain Assyrian districts in the upper Euphrates Valley, but the Hittite people had also snatched some of its territory, and the powerful rival of Babylon still lay to the south. But Tiglath-Pileser didn't waste any time. He attacked the Mushku first and conquered them, and then drove out the Hittites and Aramaeans. And everywhere he went, he placed a record of his victories. In one of the strong fortresses he built along his border, he engraved the following message on a series of copper plates in the base of the walls.
Altogether, I conquered 42 lands and their rulers. From the other side of the lower Zab in distant mountainous regions to the other side of the Euphrates, people of Hatti, and the upper sea in the west.
The king Tiglath-Pileser also loved to hunt, and he delighted in bringing back live specimens of animals from the faraway lands that he campaigned in.
I killed 10 strong bull elephants in the land Haran and the region of the river Habor, and 4 live elephants I captured. I brought the hides and tusks of the dead elephants, along with the live elephants, back to my city of Ashur.
It's hard to know how the average Assyrian citizen of the time would have felt about all of this, since their accounts were not recorded. We can imagine that, at the very least, a great deal of wealth would now be flowing into the city of Ashur. Teams of construction workers would have been working day and night to build new palaces and gardens in the city. Exotic, never-before-seen animals might now be seen on the streets, while access to new trade routes may have meant that new spices and fabrics would have begun to appear in the city markets. Tiglath-Pileser swept his Assyrian armies west, and when he conquered the Hittite town of Pitru, he gained control of the highway to the Mediterranean Sea. a distant body of water that, for the Assyrians, constituted one edge of the entire world. Assyria at this time was the only great power in this region with no access to a coastline, and we can see something of the wonder in the king Tiglath-Pileser's words when he boasts about going on board a ship for the first time. The Assyrian chronicles even record that he hunted and killed some kind of sea creature known as a Nahiru.
I killed a Nahiru, which is called Horse of the Sea, in the great sea of the land of Amuru.
We don't know what this animal was. Many believe it may have been a dolphin or a whale, while others say it was likely a hippopotamus. But it shows what a novelty it was for the king of the landlocked kingdom of Assyria to finally reach the water. Tiglath-Pileser died in the year 1076 BC, and on his deathbed he must have looked back on a life of staggering success. During his violent rule, Assyria recovered much of the territory that it had lost over the period of the Bronze Age collapse. He had grown his kingdom into an empire that was all but unmatched in the region, and he must have looked ahead to the dawning of a golden age for Assyria. But the fortunes of Assyria would soon change for good with the reign of a king named Adad-nirari II. Adad-nirari was crowned in the year 910 BC, nearly 3,000 years ago, and it's worth mentioning that his reign is perhaps the first event in the entirety of Near Eastern history that can be dated to an exact year with 100% confidence. The Assyrians, like the peoples before them, didn't keep track of years with numbers like we do. Instead, they gave each year a name, sometimes named after a particular person as a kind of honor, or named after a significant event that had taken place, like a great battle or an eclipse of the sun. Assyrian scribes kept long, meticulous lists of these year names, along with brief notes about important events that had taken place, as the following example shows, corresponding to 3 years at the end of the 8th century BC.
The year of Chamberlain Tab-Shar-Assur, the city of Dua-Sharukin was founded. The year of Shamash-Upahir, governor of Haburi, Kumuhi was conquered and a governor was appointed. The year of Shah-Assur-Dabu, governor of Tushan, the king returned from Babylon, the vizier and nobles. The loot of Dua-Jakin was destroyed on the 22nd of Teshrit. The gods of Dua-Sharukin entered the temples.
This system worked well enough for people of the time, but it means that if a modern historian wants to work out the date of a particular event, they need to have an unbroken list of year names, and for that list to include a known historical event, or an astronomical event that can be clearly dated, like a solar eclipse. Luckily for us, the Assyrians were obsessed with eclipses, believing them to be important omens from the gods, and they kept incredibly careful note of any that occurred. And the reign of Adad-nirari is the beginning of the earliest one of these lists. He was an ambitious king, and he soon began to expand in all directions, into what is today Turkey, Iran, and the Mediterranean coast, drawing on the strength of the formidable Assyrian army. The life of an Assyrian soldier was a tough one. Adad-nirari's armies were made up primarily of men drawn from the fields. They would spend much of their year working on farmsteads with their families, digging canals and turning the dusty earth with plows and hand tools, growing beans and pulses, wheat and barley, raising livestock like sheep, pigs, and cattle. And then, when the spring came, the rains stopped, and the winter mud hardened across the land. They would be gathered up